Now the river simulation that we've set up so far is looking quite cool, and it works really nicely for the wider shots, but for some of these close-up shots, the resolution doesn't really hold up. We need to run the sim at higher res in order for it to look good this close to camera. So fortunately we can use the previous simulation as input to help drive our new sim and really preserve a lot of the same setup and same general look for this. So let's go back into our setup here, turn off the display of the render object for that water, and then go down to our river setup. And we're going to copy this river setup and paste a copy of the entire thing. And I'll rename this to river close-up, and then dive inside there. And let's set our display flag to the area of interest just before we apply that sim scale. So for this close-up shot, I've set up a moving camera. It does make for a much nicer shot when we do this little push in across the length of the shot like this. But when we set up the trimming from our previous simulation to drive this new sim, we don't want that trim to be changing over time. So we're going to set up camera-based trimming, but I'm just going to do it when the camera is at its widest. So let's go to the first frame of the shot. I've set up the close-up shot to go from frame 15 to frame 100. So anywhere from 15 or prior is going to be the widest point for that camera. So let's go to a frame where the camera view is at its widest, and then we can make a copy of this current view by holding Control and then hitting this camera button on the shelf. So this makes a new camera based on our current view, and you can see that's brought us back up to the object level here where it's created that new camera. So I'll just move this camera over to where we have all the other cameras set up, and we have our animated world space camera here, and I'll rename this one to Water Cam Static. And currently our new static camera is in world space, the space that we use to render this, but all of our setup work for the simulation is being done in our sim scale. So it's up to you if you want to scale down the volumes that we generate from this in the actual setup, or you can scale down the camera itself by dropping in a null above it. And I'll call this sim scale and connect that to the static water cam. And then on the sim scale, we'll just set the uniform scale to the same scale that we're using for simulation space. In this case, that's 0.2. So once we change that on the sim scale null here, you can see the camera that we've parented to that is now shrunken down to our simulation scale. So if we go back to the river close-up setup and put our display flag on the simulation scale area of interest, you can see this all lines up properly, and this view is static in space and it's not changing at all, so we can use this camera to safely cut out a portion of our previous sim to use for the new simulation. And to generate a cutout based on the camera, I'm going to use a volume SOP, and on this volume I'll set this from camera and select our water cam static for that camera, and then let's display that volume. And let's also template view this area of interest here. If we take a look at the volume that's being generated here, we can't really see anything in the viewport. So let's set an initial value on this of 1. And now you can see it is creating a little volume for our camera position here. And that volume is very small because this defaults to some Z near and far clipping planes of 1 and 2. So we want to extend the far clipping plane to fully encompass the area of our simulation. So I'll use a value of 40. So this safely includes the entire area that we need to simulate here, but this volume is incredibly low resolution. So let's go down to the sampling for this. I'll leave this on sampling by max axis, and I'll turn this up to 100 divisions. So this gives us a much nicer volume for that camera frustum. And when we do a cutout based on this camera, we want to make sure that we expand the area that we're cutting out a bit beyond the actual camera view. So on this window X and Y, we're going to expand this range a bit. 0 to 1 is just going to perfectly align this frustum with the actual view in the camera. So the first value I'll set below 0 to minus 0.3, and the second value to 1.3. So that's expanding our view 30%. and I'll do the same thing on y, minus 0.3 and 1.3. So this will give us a little bit of buffer region. And ultimately, I want to convert this to an SDF volume. And usually, you can convert fog volumes to VDB SDFs by using a VDB convert. So if you drop that in and set the convert to VDB, and then the class will be fog to SDF. And then if you display that, most of the time, this will give you a nice SDF that matches the fog that you've input. But in this case, when we're doing this camera-based volume thing, it doesn't seem to work very nicely. So we're going to generate this SDF a little bit differently. So I'll just delete that convert VDB, and instead, let's use a convert volume. So this will give us a polygon representation of that camera volume, and then this we can easily convert into a VDB SDF. So I'll drop in a VDB from polygons, and this SDF can be quite low resolution. It won't really impact the detail of our sim, so I'll raise the voxel size to 0.3 to make this a fairly lightweight SDF. And then we can make another copy of this camera setup that's not quite as wide, and then subtract it from this one to just generate an SDF for the edge region. So let's just duplicate the same camera setup here, but on the volume, I'm going to change the range. I'll push it slightly further in Z, I'll push that out to 50, and I'll change the X range to only go from minus 0.1 to 1.1, so we only get a 10% expansion instead of 30, but then I'll make it wider in Y. We'll do minus 0.5 to 1.5, so it's a bit taller, and then we can subtract this SDF from the other one. So I'll drop in a VDB combine, attach the wider version to the first input, the more narrow version into the second, and then set the operation to SDF difference, and display that VDB combine, and you can see this just gives us the edge region. So I'll drop in a null there, and call this edge region. And we're not going to use this edge region just yet, we'll use that a little bit later. For the moment, I'm just going to use the wider volume to trim down our area of interest. So let's add a group SOP on this area of interest here. I'll put this just after the sim scale. And then for the second input of that group SOP, I'm going to wire this into the wider of those camera volumes. And I'll call this group InCam. Set the group type to points, turn off the base group, turn on keep in bounding regions, and select bounding object, and display that group. Let's turn off our template view from the area of interest there. So now this is just selecting the area that's in the view of the camera. And then we can drop in a blast SOP to just isolate that region. So in that blast, I'll select the InCam group and display that, and then flip this blast to delete non-selected. And because we don't really need that InCam group anymore, you can go ahead and delete that group if you'd like. So I'll drop in a group delete and remove InCam. So now we've limited the area of interest to just what's in our camera view, plus a little extra on the side. And now we can go ahead and start trimming our previous simulation. So to import that previous sim, I'm going to set my scene updating to manual so it doesn't cook anything when we go over to that river setup, and then jump over to that river setup, and we're going to add a null to reference our simulation. We could just point an object merge to this cache river sim file cache there, but as you've seen many times before, I generally always like to point things to nulls instead. So I'll add in this null here, switch over the connections to that, and I'll call this out cached sim. And then if we go back to the river close-up, we can import that simulation. So I'll drop in an object merge here and point this to object/river/out cached sim, and turn the scene updating back to auto update, and then display that simulation. And this imported sim has the results from our fluid compress, which has our particles, and it has volumes for the fluid surface and the velocity. So I'm going to start by isolating the fluid surface. So I'll just drop in a blast SOP In the group, I'll select Surface and flip this to Delete Non-Selected, and then display that. But we don't see anything in our viewport at all. But we can enable the display for this if you drop in a primitive SOP, and on the Volumes tab, turn on Adjust Visualization, and set the display mode to ISO surface. And then display this primitive SOP, and now you can see this full surface for that frame of the sim. So now that we have this SDF here, let's trim this out to the current camera area. So I'll drop in a VDB combine, connect the surface to the first input, and for the second input, we'll use the wider version of our camera volume. And on this VDB combine, let's set this operation to SDF intersection. So you can see this is trimming down our fluid surface to just the area that we need. And I'll drop in a null here to label this for clarity. I'll call this surface CU for close-up. I'll probably use this CU abbreviation for close-up related things quite a bit in this setup. And since we have this current frame of the simulation chopped out, we can use this to source some particles for our new sim. So we can wire this right into our flip source, but we already have a bunch of flip source stuff set up that we've copied over from our previous setup here. And a lot of this can be deleted now. So previously we had built the source region to fill the entire area of the river. That's what all this VDB stuff does here. So I'll just delete all of that. And for this sim, I'm not going to bother caching out that source. I'm just going to grab it live from our previous simulation. Of course, you can enable caches in the middle of your setup anywhere you want, but I'm just going to delete this one. And I'm also going to pull the flow velocity out of this sourcing portion for now, and delete the attribute transfer that we're using to pick up the flow velocity on these particles, because instead of using the flow velocity as the initial velocity for the sim, we're actually going to pick up the existing velocity from that previous simulation. So for this new source, let's drag in this simulation cutout that we've already set up, drag this into our source region, and you can wire this cutout of the surface into the flip source. And now if you display the source particles after the flip source and after the split here, you can see this is generating particles based on the surface of the previous simulation. However, we do need to pick up the velocities from the previous sim as well. If you turn on point velocity trails in the viewport, you can see we're not getting any velocities currently, and we don't just want to use the flow direction velocity like we did before. We want to use the actual simulation velocities. So just before this source particles null, I'm going to add a wrangle here. Drop that wrangle before the null, and I'll call this sample velocities, because we're going to use this wrangle to grab the velocity values from the previous sim. So we've already grabbed the surface from the previous sim, but we can use another blast SOP to isolate the velocity volumes. So drop in that blast, connect it to our cached out simulation, and in this blast under the group, I'll select the velocity volume and flip this to delete non-selected and display it. And as before, we can't see this in our viewport at all, but just like we did before with this other primitive SOP, we can use a primitive SOP to display the velocity also. And just for clarity, I'll rename that primitive to display VDB. And I'll copy that and paste it underneath our velocity volume and hook that up. But for our velocities, it doesn't really make sense to try to display them as an ISO surface. So for the display mode on the velocity, I'll set that to smoke. And if you wanted to, you could set up a volume trail to see what these velocities really look like, or just trust that those are the correct velocities from the sim. But either way, we can see what those velocities look like once we sample that onto the particles. So let's hook up this velocity volume to the second input on this wrangle. And then in this sample velocities wrangle, I'll say v at v to create a velocity attribute equals volume sample v, which will grab a vector attribute from the input volume. And we're looking at input 1 and volume primitive number 0 at the current position P. So now if we display the source particles, now you can see that all of these particles are picking up those velocities from the simulation. So when you start simulating these particles, these will pick up the motion that the simulation currently had at that frame. And right now we're not really going to benefit from this at all because our resolution is the same as the previous sim. We copied over the entire setup, including this flip source and its resolution settings. So I'm going to try doubling the resolution of this and setting that particle separation to 0.02. So now we're getting much more density out of these particles, and that's all looking pretty cool. And we have this voxel size parameter here linked to the particle separation times 2, and that voxel size is also used for our collider setup. So we can go over to the colliders here. If you look at the collision source, you can see this is now using that linked higher resolution voxel size. So on this cache here, we can change this file name to River Collide Closeup version 1 and save that to disk. So now if you display this collision volume, you can see this is a fairly high-res collider that's significantly more detailed than the collider version that we used for the wide shot. If you compare that to the collision geo, you can see this volume is a pretty good representation of that. So now that we have this nice updated collision object at a higher resolution, let's update our boundaries as well. So previously, we had built our boundaries based on a bunch of VDB intersection and such, but because we have this nice previous simulation as input now, we can instead build some of our boundaries by chopping up some portions of that previous sim. However, these initial frames of the previous sim are pretty boring and flat because it does take some time for this to evolve and start looking nice. So let's add a time shift on this. And we did have to add a time shift to the wide river when we were rendering it. We added, I believe it was 40 frames of offset so that this would look nice on the first frame. So we can do the same thing here. I'll drop in a time shift, place this just after our imported simulation, which I suppose we can rename to keep things nice and clean. Call that imported simulation. And on this time shift, I'll use this time offset preset and set that offset to 40 frames. So now we have this nice, interesting input right away. And currently, we're clipping this to the camera region for our initial flip source input. But we can do some more clipping on this to just create an edge region that will serve as our boundary source. So currently, our boundary source is already set up down here. So I'm just going to delete all of this setup. And I'm going to bring our boundary source null up into our source flip section instead. And we're going to do an SDF intersection with the edge region that we've already set up with the cameras. And of course you can create the VDB combine as we have been doing, but there are some shortcuts to some of the initial settings of the VDB combine. So if you type in SDF, you can see some options here such as SDF intersect and subtract and union and etc. And these will create VDB combine SOPs with the operation already set for you. So this can potentially speed up your workflow a bit. In this case, we're going to do an SDF intersect. So if you drop that in here, you can see that's just a VDB combine with SDF intersection already set and the node named SDF intersect. So let's connect our input surface to that and the camera edge region to the second input here. And just to make this a little bit cleaner, I'm going to alt click on this wire to create a breakpoint and move that breakpoint over here. It's just a bit visually cleaner that way. And if you display that, you can see this is successfully creating these end plugs that we need for that boundary surface. So I'll connect that to the boundary surface null that we've already set up. And when I deleted the previous setup for that boundary surface, I made sure to maintain this existing null here rather than recreating that, because maintaining our existing nulls from the old setup will make sure that these connections still exist in our flip solver. So if we go back inside our DOPNet, and then go to the gas guiding volume, you can see that we have our existing connections to the boundary surface and velocity in sync. We can click the arrow to jump over to those. And because those connections are already set up, that's why I've made sure to not delete the null when I delete all of this other stuff here. You can, of course, relink this to the gas guiding volume and the DOPNet if necessary, just trying to avoid that little bit of trouble. So now that we have this boundary surface set up, let's go ahead and set up the boundary velocity. So we already have the velocity being imported from the previous sim here, which doesn't look like much visually in the viewport, but this does have all of the nice velocity data from that previous sim. And for the boundary velocity, we can just quickly clip this to the edge regions that we need. So if you drop in a VDB clip SOP and connect that to the velocity, you can see there's an option to clip to geometry as default, but another option is this mask VDB here. So let's select that, and then connect the edge region to the second input of that VDB clip. So if you display that, you can see this is just giving us those pieces of that velocity volume that exist within the edge region that we've defined from those camera volumes. So these little velocity wedges there match these edge SDFs that we've already set up. So this should work well for our boundary velocity. So let's delete this old boundary velocity setup here. I'll just keep this boundary velocity null and drag that up to our VDB clip. Disconnect that, reconnect it to the VDB clip, and there we have our boundary velocity nice and easy. Once again, this won't be visible in our static camera, but if you zoom out a bit, then you can see those velocities on the edges there. Now for the boundary sync layer, we can base this purely on the camera volumes. So if we go down to the current boundary sync, I'm just going to delete this entire setup except for that null. And I'll drag this boundary sync null up to where our cameras are. Delete this unnecessary net box now. And then I'm going to add an additional camera volume to use for the boundary sync. So I'll copy this wide camera volume here, paste in a copy of that. And if it's confusing to keep track of which camera volumes are which, you may want to label these. Perhaps I'll call this one VolCam wide. Copy that null, paste it on this one. This is VolCam tall. And for this new copy of the camera volume, I'm going to make this one wider. So on those volume settings, I'll set the width to -0.6 to 1.6 and display that. So this one's going to be even wider than our other volume camera wide. So I'll rename this null to VolCam widest. And then for this one, let's do an SDF subtraction. So type VDB SDF subtract to drop in that VDB combine that's preset to SDF difference. So I'll put the widest camera volume in the first input, the tall camera volume in the second. Connect that to the boundary sync and display that. So now we have this boundary sync to kill particles that's a bit wider than our edge region. So let's template display our boundary surface relative to that sync region. And actually it looks like our boundary surface is still sitting entirely within the sync volume, and I generally prefer to have the sync volume sitting a bit wider out than the boundary surface is. We can't see the boundary surface at all when we template display that because it's totally contained within this boundary sync volume here. So if I get rid of that boundary sync display, you can see our current boundary surface is just entirely stuck inside there. So let's widen this gap between those edges of that boundary sync a bit. So instead of subtracting this tall camera volume, I'm going to just make a copy of that so we can customize this a bit. I'll drag my boundary sync off to the side here and make a copy of this tall camera volume setup. Paste that in here. Connect that to the SDF subtract, and then we can play around with the window X parameters to create just the amount of buffer region that we need. So maybe I'll try -0.25 and 1.25. So now you can see that this will be killing particles that go too far into those boundary areas, but this sync boundary doesn't extend all the way to the very inner edges of these boundary regions. So this looks like it should work pretty well. So we've set up the boundary sync, we've set up the boundary surface, the boundary velocity, and while we're checking boundary stuff, let's also double check the overall simulation bounds. So we have our area of interest over here, so I'll display that. And we still have our bounds connected to that, so this is correctly updating our simulation bounds. And this bound null is still being referenced inside our flip solver. And you can verify that that's still connected properly by going into your DOPNet, and then going to the flip solver, and under the volume motion and volume limits tabs, you can see our box size is connected to that bound null. So that bound looks all good. We don't need to update anything there. So now the last thing that we need to update here is our flow velocity that will help to keep this current running. Now the flow velocity might be a little bit less important for this short river versus the longer one. So you can feel free to try this without the flow velocity if you'd like. And this flow velocity is this force that we've added via this pop advect by volumes here. So if you want to, you can try running your initial close-up sims with this disabled to see what that looks like, but I'm just going to stick with leaving this in there for now. And I think this will help us to maintain a consistent look from the wide shot to the close-up. And for this flow velocity, you could try a couple different things. You could use the original velocity from the previous simulation, and instead of clipping this velocity to the edge regions like we did for the boundary velocity, we could set up a different clip that just clips the velocity to the general camera area. So I'll copy this VDB clip with that boundary velocity. And instead of boundary velocity, I'm going to call this null flowvel from sim. And for this VDB clip, instead of connecting that to the edge region, I'm going to connect this to our volume camera wide. Now after clipping our velocity to the camera area with that SDF, the velocity volume itself is looking a little bit weird. And we are used to the smoke visualization for velocity looking a bit strange, so it's not always a problem or a red flag when your velocity volume looks weird, but this does look like it's getting kind of clipped off in an unnatural way, and it's always a good idea if you're at all suspicious to check the velocities with a volume trail. So let's drop in our volume trail, connect the flow velocity to the second input, and for the points in the first input, I'm going to generate a new set of points with a pyro source, and I'll connect that pyro source to the surface for our close-up sourcing. That's our previous simulation surface that's been clipped to the camera here. So this will serve nicely to create some points to use in our volume trail. But if you display the pyro source, it doesn't show us this volume filled with points because we need to set the mode to volume scatter. So now we have that volume filled with points. We can connect that to the volume trail to see what we have after that VDB clip. And you can see that it's not just a visual display issue. The velocities are getting clipped poorly here, and the reason for this is a little bit tricky. So if we disable the VDB clip here, you can see this is what our velocities should look like. And the issue with the VDB clipped version is the way that the SDF volume for the camera is constructed. So if you take a look at our VDB from polygons here, this VDB tries to do a good job at optimizing how much data it's storing. So it's not storing actual voxel values in the entirety of this bounding box here. It's storing these into like a hierarchy of internal boxes. And you can see what that hierarchy looks like if you use VDB visualize tree. So if we drop that in here, connect that to our volume camera wide, and show this tree, you can see these are the actual regions that are active in this VDB. And this is not just for the exterior of the VDB, it's also throwing away some data in the interior here. It's a little bit hard to see if I zoom in, but it's not storing all of the values throughout the entire interior of this volume as well. The amount of interior and exterior space that's filled is controlled by the exterior and interior band voxels here. So if we increase the interior band voxels, I'll try turning this up to 10, then you can see some regions activating inside the middle of the volume there. So setting that back to 3, it's a little bit hard to see in this view, but there are fewer active regions. And I'll try turning this up to 30, and you can see the interior of this volume is now filled up. And I'll set that back to default, and we have the same controls for the exterior. So if I turn that up to 15, that's expanding the range of data storage in the volume. And these active regions and the limits of the stored values are the reason that the VDB clip looks a little weird when we use this to mask out the velocity volume. But thankfully we have an easy fix for this. So let's put our display back on the volume trail and zoom in on that. And back on the VDB for the wide camera, if you turn on this Fill Interior option, then this will activate the entire interior of this VDB region. So it's not throwing away all of the interior data deeper inside that volume. And this totally fixes our issue with that VDB clip. Now we're seeing the results that we expect. And this is what I used for the original version of my sim for some additional advection force. However, it may make sense to keep things consistent with the forces that we used for the wide version of the river and use the more straight directional version of our flow velocity that we already set up via this curve here. So to keep things organized, let's drag this flow velocity setup out of our fluid source section here. And let's expand our flow velocity net box to contain both of our flow velocity options. And let's add a sticky note and call this flow option number 1. And our previous setup based on the curve will be flow option number 2. And currently, this curve here is just a curve with some velocity on it. As we saw before, you can turn on point velocity trails, and then you have to really crank up this constant multiplier on the attribute adjust vector in order to see those. But you can see all of these velocity directions are working correctly. So now let's build a volume in our region of interest just based on this flow velocity from the curve. And to keep this consistent with how it was set up in the wide shot, I'm going to generate this flow velocity volume based on that flat river volume that represents the desired water level of the river. So you could reconstruct that volume like we did before, or we could just import that from the wide shot setup. So I'll drop in an object merge, point this to object/river/source volume, and display that. So you can see this gives us the entire source region for that river. And as we've seen before, we can clip this SDF region to the area that we're interested in based on that camera SDF volume. So I'll drop in an SDF intersect, which as we saw before is just a VDB combine with operation set to SDF intersection. And then I'll wire in our source volume into the first input of that SDF intersect, connect the second input to that camera volume. And because we have a couple things over here connected to this same wide camera volume, we can organize our scene a little bit more nicely if we add in a breakpoint by alt-clicking here. And you can connect multiple wires to that same breakpoint. So I'll just connect this one as well, since both our flow velocity from the previous sim and this intersection here are both based on that same wide camera. So it's just a helpful bit of organization there. And now if you display that SDF intersection, that gives us the source region that we're interested in here, and we can generate some points in that region with a pyro source. Connect that to that SDF, set the pyro source mode to volume scatter, display that pyro source, and I'm going to try just this default amount of particle separation for now, because I'm not really expecting a lot of detail out of this flow velocity here. And then we can do an attribute transfer of the velocity from our curve onto the points. So connect these pyro source points to the first input of that attribute transfer. the curve with those velocity values into the second input. And in this attribute transfer, let's turn off primitive attribute transfer, and under points, select velocity. And for conditions, let's just turn off the distance threshold. So now we have these points with velocity that matches the general curve of the river. There's not a lot of river curve going on here, so it's not super obvious. It is a fairly straight curve at this portion of the river, but we are picking up those velocity directions. And now that we have the points with velocity, we can go ahead and rasterize that. So I'll drop in a volume rasterize attributes, connect that to our attribute transfer. I'm going to stick with the default voxel size because this isn't a very detailed velocity. Of course, you could try to randomize these velocities a bit and see what that looks like, but I'm going to leave this as it is. So under attributes, let's select that velocity attribute there, display the volume rasterize attributes, and we can't really see anything here, but we can test these volumes. So dropping in that volume trail, we can connect our pyro source points to the first input, our new rasterized velocity volume into the second. And you can see these volume directions are working correctly. So this should work well for the alternate velocity volume to use in that pop advect by volumes, just to keep that flow going in the river. And just below everything we just set up, we have the old setup for the flow velocity that was just copied over from the original wide version of that river. So we can delete all of this stuff, except for this flow velocity null that's going to be connected already inside our DOPNet. So I'll drag this null into our new setup, connect that to the volume rasterize attributes that we just created, and we can verify that this is still connected in our DOPNet. So diving back inside our DOPNet here, and looking at that pop advect by volumes, you can see this is pointed to the flow velocity null, which we can jump to by hitting this arrow. And you can see that's correctly linked here. Another interesting thing you can do to see what some of the various links are between nodes in your scene is to go to the View menu here, and then select under Dependency Links, either Show for all nodes, which could be potentially overwhelming, or just show for selected nodes. So if you pick that, and then select any of these nodes here, it'll show some of those links. So we don't directly have the flow velocity wired into the DOPNet, but you can see with that dependency link view setting that there is a connection there. Should see something similar with our collide volume and collide geo. And of course with all of these other inputs as well, our source particles and boundary velocity and boundary surface and etc. all show that they're linked to this DOPNet. Lots of links everywhere. But that option can be a little bit annoying if you don't need the information, so I'm going to set that back to hide. And now with all of that stuff set up, let's try running our simulation. Inside the DOPNet, I'm going to leave everything set as it is, although I'm going to turn down the velocity smoothing for a more energetic sim. So I'll turn this down to 0.06, which is also the value that I used for the original version of the full wide river sim. So with everything set up, how we'd like it for this initial version of that close-up sim, I'm going to jump out of the DOPNet, and then on this file cache, I'm going to change this path to write to a directory for this close-up shot instead. So in that path, I'll just change wide to close-up. And for my close-up shot, I've set the frame range to go from 15 to 100. So I'll try starting my simulation from frame 1. And I think in this case, just 15 frames of pre-roll before the start of the shot should just be fine. And because the end frame of the shot is 100, I'll just try ending it there in this case. Of course, you can simulate a longer range if you'd like, so that you have the option to time offset to pick your favorite portion of the simulation. But for now, I'll just simulate 1 through 100. And before we write this out to disk, I'm just going to try flipbooking a few frames to make sure this is all working correctly. So I'll dive inside the river sim here and go to the static version of our camera. And you can see this is already starting in a fairly nice shape because this is based on our original river simulation, and that's part of the reason that I don't feel like I need quite as much pre-roll for this shot. So this is already looking promising on that very first frame. And now let's flipbook a portion of this just to make sure that it's working nicely. Now I've only flipbooked 12 frames here, but this is enough to see that the simulation is looking quite nice and everything appears to be working properly. And for a high-res simulation like this, I generally don't like to flipbook at the same time that I'm writing the simulation to disk, because I think that might just be asking a little bit too much of the machine, and displaying this high resolution sim and flipbooking that to mplay will take additional resources that we could just dedicate to our sim. So I'm not going to flipbook this while I'm simming and caching it. I'll just jump out of our DOPNet here, display that fluid compress to make sure that that all looks good. Verify that we're writing this cache to a new path. We're not overwriting that wide river since we copied this entire setup, and then save that to disk. Now after caching the simulation to disk, we can display this view particles SOP. It's just our particle fluid surface with the output convert to set to particles and the visualize on velocity, and then do a flipbook of this. And after flipbooking that cached simulation, this sim is looking awesome. It's super detailed, there's lots of nice and natural motion in this, and this is looking really promising. Of course, we have to mesh this and then see what the final render mesh looks like, but just based on the particles, I'm pretty happy with this, so we can go ahead and start the meshing. And now to mesh the simulation, we already have this particle fluid surface SOP set up since we had copied this entire setup from the previous wide shot simulation. And the only change we need to make here is that we can remove this subtract collision volumes option. That's under the regions tab here. And previously, we had those extra bits of the simulation sticking out past the environment, so we had to chop those off. But since those boundary regions are out of camera now, we don't really need to subtract any sections from our meshed sim, so we can just turn off subtract collision volumes, and then just delete these regions that we were previously subtracting from the mesh. So that simplifies our meshing setup quite a bit. So we can condense this here to keep things nice and clean. And before caching this out, let's check one frame of this mesh to make sure all looks good. Now this was a bit slow to generate this mesh because it is a very high resolution sim, but everything looks good, so let's kick off the cache for this. And on this file cache, make sure that you change the path to point to your close-up river shot so that you don't overwrite the wide shot since we had copied over this entire setup. Anytime you're copying setups, you have to be very careful to change the file cache names, otherwise you might overwrite things that you don't intend to. And for the simulation, we made sure to cache out our pre-roll, but for our meshed version, we don't really need to cache any extra frames. It's totally fine to just cache out the mesh for the frames that cover our actual shot range. And this close-up shot runs from frame 15 through 100, so I'm only caching out those frames of this mesh. So with the path updated and the frame numbers updated, let's save that to disk. And it did take a while for this mesh to cache out because it is such a high-res sim. But now that it's done, let's display those results. If we display the file cache for frame 15, the first frame of the shot, this is already looking quite good. So we don't really need to do any extra time shifting here. So I'm just going to disable this time shift and then display our color SOP that's coloring the mesh based on speed. And currently this is using the render scale mesh. So I'm going to reconnect this directly to the cache so that it's bypassing the sim scale inversion. So now we can see our colorized mesh in the correct space, but I'm going to modify these colors a bit. Just to make this look nicer, I'm going to turn down this color range. In this case, it looks like applying that color ramp across speed values from -2 to 11 looks pretty nice. So we can run a flipbook based on this. And after flipbooking our cached out render mesh, This is all looking quite cool. There's tons of detail in the sim, lots of nice and natural motion, and this will of course look much nicer once it's rendered with a proper shader and lighting and everything, but overall, this is looking really good. There is one section of the sim that I'm not very happy with. I don't really like the way that the water runs down this big rock in the middle of the frame there. That doesn't look very good. So you could run the sim extra long and then just start the simulation a bit later using that time shift, or we could change the initial input into our simulation because we were using our previous wide shot simulation as the starting point for this close-up sim. So if we display our wide shot simulation input and take a look at the surface for that and go back to the start frame, you can see that the wide shot simulation already has a big wave splashing over that rock here. So if we wanted to avoid that in our final version, we could certainly just change the time shift on our imported sim to start our simulation of the close shot at a different frame here. So those are just two ways you could address this problem: time shifting the input simulation, or running the sim long and time shifting it afterwards. Of course, there are lots of ways that you can troubleshoot anything in Houdini, so you can certainly modify other sim parameters if you'd like, but those two options I think would be the easiest way to address this slightly odd looking section in the middle of that simulation there. In any case, this is all looking quite good overall, so let's set up the render for this. And I'm going to go over the render for this quite briefly because it's not really any different than how we've set up the previous renders. We already have a render null set up for this meshed river, which is after the sim scale invert that puts this into the proper rendering space. You can see that here. So let's go up to the object context and then look at our render objects here. And we can duplicate our existing render object for the water. Call this one render water close up, and then dive inside here. And we can just update this object merge to point to the river close up setup instead. So that object merge will point to object river close up and that render null. And as I update this object merge path, you can see how much nicer this mesh looks once it switches over to that high res up close version. And we already have the shader set up on this render object here. You can use that same RS water shader. And under Redshift object, settings, and render, you can see we do have the mesh deformation blur from velocity attribute turned on, which is defaulting to V, which is correct. And we can set up the Redshift ROP for this close-up shot as well. So I'll copy this wide environment Redshift render. I'll call this water close-up. And for this water close-up shot, I'm not going to include the creatures at all. You can include the creatures if you'd like, but I don't really find it necessary for such a close-up shot, which also means we can remove the creature lights from the force lights here. And under force objects, let's update this to remove the standard render water object, add the water close-up object, and we can also change out our render env for the version that has no destruction fractures in it, because for this close-up shot, we really don't want to load up all of that destruction geometry as well. So I'll use my env no fracture. And let's also update the camera for this. So under main, bring up our selector and select our water camera close-up world. And under the Redshift settings, I'm verifying that motion blur is turned on, so that's good. And I'm going to go to the advanced mode for Redshift settings. I'm more accustomed to using these sampling parameters under the advanced version of the UI here, but you can certainly feel free to stick with the basic version if you'd like. And for the test renders, I'm going to turn off automatic sampling, and I'll leave the min and max samples on 4 and 64 for now to see how that looks. And then let's go to the Redshift render view. Under Houdini, select ROP. I'll select water close-up, and then run this IPR render. Now I didn't let this render run for very long, so it is quite noisy, and we can see everything is working from a technical standpoint. Our water mesh is in there, looks like it has the correct shader, our environment all looks correct, but I've stopped this render so that we can adjust the lighting. The lighting doesn't look very nice at this point. I don't want so much of the environment in the water to be in shadow like this, so let's update the lighting for this shot. So we'll go back to the object context, and go over to this light dome here. And we don't just want to edit this light dome directly, because that will affect all the shots that are using this light. So I'm going to make a copy of that and paste in that copy here. I'll call this light dome water close up, and then we can just rotate this a bit on the y-axis to change the lighting direction. I'll try rotating it by -100 degrees. So let's go back to our redshift ROP. And I'm also going to turn down the max samples a bit to speed this up because the render seemed to be going fairly slowly. And then under the Objects tab, let's change our Force Lights to use that new light dome that we just created. That's the RS Light Dome Water Close-Up. And now with that updated, let's rerun our render. And now after rendering this test frame again, this is looking much nicer after changing that light direction. Not only is the environment looking nicer, but the water is picking up some really nice specular highlights, and that's going to really help bring out a lot of the detail in that water surface, and overall everything is looking very good. So we can go ahead and render out the entire sequence for this shot. And this shot goes from frame 15 to 100 in my case. And under the Output and Common tab, I'll change this path here to write to a water directory, and I'll add the HIP name to the path here so we can easily keep track of what file this render came from. And I often like to put the HIP name in the file name as well, so I'll call the rendered file water-hipname.$f3.exr. And just to make sure that these variables are evaluating properly in this path here, we can middle mouse on this parameter name, so we can see the exact path that this is writing to. So this looks all good, and now we can render this to disk. And after rendering out the shot, you should wind up with a result that looks like this. And of course your version won't have this white water layer in it just yet, because we haven't talked about that yet, and we'll be taking a look at that element next. But at this point, you should have a nice looking water surface, and you should be well on your way to a very nice complete water shot once this white water is added.